Hey guys, tonight we're setting sail for the roughest waters history has to offer, the world of pirates. Not the Johnny Depp kind, not the treasure maps and parrots kind. I mean the real, actual pirates, greasy, sunburnt and permanently hungry, bobbing around the world's oceans in splintery death traps. Before you get comfortable, I want to say a genuine thank you to everyone who suggested this topic. Your comments and messages genuinely shape what gets made here, and knowing you're out there, listening and engaged, means more than I can say. So take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening on Spotify, the link to the channel is in the description. We're there now, so come find us. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow, it's always 2 a.m. somewhere. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe tuck your feet in so the imaginary rats can't nibble your toes. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what pirate life actually felt like? Was there really that much treasure? Did pirates ever brush their teeth? Or did they just hope the scurvy took them before the toothache did? What did they eat when the ship's rats went missing? Could you survive weeks at sea with nothing but dried biscuits and a hope that nobody noticed you were out of rum? Would you last a day swabbing decks in the Caribbean sun? Or would you accidentally start a mutiny over someone stealing your last onion? What happened when you got sick 500 miles from land? Was there a doctor? Spoiler, there was a man with a saw. Did pirates actually get a vote on where the ship went? Or was that just something they told new recruits to keep them calm? And perhaps most importantly, what exactly did a pirate ship smell like after 3 weeks at sea in August? The answer is worse than you're imagining. Much worse. And now, congratulations. You've just woken up on a pirate ship. The year is 1717. You have no shoes, a very suspicious rash, and you're already seasick. Good luck. Before you even set foot on the ship, someone hands you a piece of paper. This is the Articles of Agreement, the pirate's version of an employment contract, and you're expected to sign it or make your mark if writing was a skill that had somehow passed you by. Every pirate crew operated under a set of rules unique to their ship, drawn up by the captain and voted on by the crew, and what they contained would make any modern HR department weep with confusion. You were agreeing to share the plunder according to a fixed scale, to keep your pistols clean and dry, to not gamble with the ship's money, and, in some versions, to not bring a woman aboard disguised as a man, a clause that suggests this had happened before and had not gone well. The articles varied from ship to ship, but the general structure was consistent. You received a share of whatever was taken. A common sailor might receive 1 share, a quartermaster, 2. The captain, perhaps 2.5. If you were injured in service, lost a hand, an eye, a leg, you were entitled to compensation, a fixed sum from the common fund, agreed upon in advance. Bartholomew Roberts's articles specified exactly what each limb was worth. Your right arm was worth more than your left. Your eye was worth less than your leg. Someone had done the mathematics, and everyone had agreed it was fair. This was, in its strange way, the most formal disability insurance policy available to working men in the early 18th century, which is either impressive or deeply depressing, depending on your perspective. You were also agreeing to a set of behavioral rules that would have seemed restrictive to a man who had chosen this life specifically because he wanted no rules. No lights below decks after 8 in the evening. No fighting aboard ship. No cheating the company by concealing plunder. No deserting your post during battle. Some articles banned gambling entirely. Some banned bringing aboard anyone who might cause what the articles carefully described as disturbances, a category broad enough to cover most human behavior and narrow enough to be useless in practice. Breaking the articles had consequences. Minor violations earned you a formal punishment, a beating, a reduction in share, being marooned on a sandbar with a pistol and a single charge. Major violations could theoretically earn you death, though in practice the crew's enthusiasm for capital punishment against their own shipmates depended heavily on circumstances and popularity. What the articles represented, underneath all the specific clauses, was something genuinely unusual for the era, a written social contract between the men who ran the ship and the men who sailed it. In the Royal Navy, you had no rights. Your captain could flog you for looking at him sideways, reduce your rations for perceived insolence, and work you past the point of physical collapse with legal impunity. On a pirate ship, the captain served at the crew's pleasure, and the articles existed specifically to prevent that kind of arrangement. It was, in a genuinely meaningful sense, more democratic than most of the societies these men had come from. This doesn't mean it worked perfectly. Articles were ignored, disputes erupted, captains were overthrown mid-voyage, and the written rules occasionally bore very little relationship to what actually happened on any given day. But the fact that the rules existed at all, that men who had been dismissed by every institution of their era sat down together and hammered out a formal agreement about how power would be distributed, is one of the more quietly remarkable things about the golden age of piracy. You signed your name or drew your X, and just like that, you were in. Welcome aboard. Try not to lose a limb until the compensation clause kicks in. You've signed the articles. Now take a good look at your new home. It's smaller than you hoped, older than it should be, and it smells like something died inside the hull, because something probably did. Pirate ships were not purpose-built vessels commissioned by admiralties with generous budgets. They were stolen, borrowed, or purchased for almost nothing, usually because the original owners were desperate to be rid of them. Most were merchant vessels or sloops repurposed for speed and aggression, meaning the original builders had optimized them for carrying cargo, not for comfortable long-term human habitation. Every plank groaned. Every rope frayed a little more each day. The bilge, the lowest part of the ship where water pooled, smelled so aggressively terrible that experienced sailors had simply stopped noticing it, which was perhaps the most alarming thing about them. The ideal pirate vessel was fast and maneuverable, a sloop or schooner that could outrun naval frigates in shallow coastal waters where the larger ships couldn't follow. Speed was the pirate's primary defense, more reliable than cannons and considerably less expensive. Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge was a notable exception, a large former French slave ship he captured and converted, mounting 40 cannons and projecting the kind of presence that made entire naval convoys reconsider their route. Most pirates couldn't afford that kind of statement. Most pirates made do with what they had, which was usually a vessel that could move quickly and leak only moderately. Maintenance was a constant and losing battle. Wood submerged in salt water attracts shipworm, a bivalve mollusk that bores into timber with cheerful destructiveness and hollows out a hull from the inside if given sufficient time. To prevent this, ships had to be careened regularly, dragged onto a beach, rolled onto their side, and have their hulls scraped, patched, and coated with a mixture of tar, tallow, and sulfur. This process took days, rendered the ship completely vulnerable for its duration, and had to be repeated every few months. Pirates called the locations where they careened their ships careening grounds, and a good one, secluded, shallow, with a beach wide enough to work on, was a closely guarded operational secret. Below decks, the architecture of your daily life was determined by a ship that had been designed for something else. Beams were low, passages were narrow. The gun deck, where the cannons lived, smelled of powder and rust and the particular dampness that accumulates in a confined space inhabited by many people with limited access to fresh water. The captain's cabin, if your captain had one, was at the stern, with actual windows and occasionally actual furniture. The rest of you were distributed throughout the remaining space according to rank and seniority, which in practice meant that the longest-serving crew members had claimed the spots least likely to flood, least exposed to cannon fire through the gun ports, and furthest from whatever was currently decomposing in the hold. The ship was always in motion. This sounds obvious, but its implications are relentless. Everything had to be tied down, stowed, wedged in place, or accepted as lost. Sleeping, eating, walking, working, all of it happened on a surface that was constantly tilting, rolling, and occasionally heaving with a violence that sent unsecured objects across the room. You adjusted to this over weeks, developing what sailors called Sea legs, a perpetual slight crouch, a constant low-level muscular awareness of the deck beneath you. Landlubbers who hadn't yet adjusted could be identified by the way they lurched, grabbed at ropes, and occasionally fell over during routine operations. You were a landlubber once. You adjusted, or you didn't, and if you didn't, the crew noticed, and the crew had opinions about people who couldn't stay upright in moderate swells. Take a look around you, because these are your shipmates, your co-workers, your involuntary roommates, and in the event of a serious emergency, your last hope for survival. The crew of a pirate ship was one of the more eclectic collections of humanity the 18th century had to offer. There were former naval sailors who had deserted after one flogging too many, merchant seamen who had been captured and offered the choice of joining or swimming, escaped indentured servants, and the occasional genuinely enthusiastic volunteer who had read one too many exciting pamphlets and was about to have several of his assumptions corrected. They came from England, Jamaica, West Africa, the American colonies, Portugal, the Netherlands. Pirate ships were among the most ethnically diverse workplaces of the era, which is a fascinating historical fact that does almost nothing to make living with them more pleasant. You will learn their names over the coming days and weeks, and some of those names will be the names they were born with, and some will not. Nicknames proliferated aboard pirate ships, partly because some men genuinely wanted a new identity, and partly because with a crew of 60 or 80 men, distinguishing between the 4 people named John required some creativity. There was almost certainly a man called something like Long Tom, and another known by a name that was a reference to an incident nobody would fully explain. The man sleeping closest to you would become, through the sheer forced intimacy of shared space, either a friend or a source of ongoing low-level misery. There was no middle ground on a ship. The social dynamics were complicated by the fact that everyone was armed. Pirates carried weapons as a matter of course, a knife at minimum, usually a pistol or two, sometimes a cutlass. Arguments that in a civilian context might result in shouting and a slammed door had, on a pirate ship, a different set of available escalations. This is why the articles were so specific about fighting aboard the vessel. It wasn't a moral objection, it was an engineering concern. A fight on a ship was a fight in a confined space full of gunpowder, rigging, and open water. The potential consequences were disproportionate to whatever the argument had started about. Within the crew, informal hierarchies formed alongside the official ones. Men who had been at sea longest commanded a quiet authority. Men who had sailed with the captain before had relationships and loyalties that shaped every decision. Men who were known to be particularly dangerous were given a wide berth. Men who were known to be weak or unreliable were assigned the worst jobs and the worst sleeping spots, and were the first to be blamed when things went wrong, a social dynamic that has not changed particularly in 300 years. Your position in this hierarchy was established in the first weeks, through a combination of the skills you demonstrated, the alliances you made, and the general impression you created, whether you were someone the crew wanted alongside them when things went wrong, or someone they would quietly move away from when things began to look difficult. There is no cabin waiting for you. There is no bunk, no mattress, no pillow. What there is, if you're lucky and have made friends quickly enough, is a hammock slung between 2 beams in the lower deck, approximately 18 inches from the man next to you, in a room that is dark at all hours, perpetually damp, and smells powerfully of everyone who has ever slept there before you. The hammock itself was, objectively speaking, a genuine improvement over sleeping on the bare deck, which some sailors did when the below-deck situation was too grim even by pirate standards. You slept in your clothes because you had no other clothes to change into. You slept with one hand near your knife because trust was a concept that operated on a sliding scale aboard a ship full of armed criminals. The hammock was a Caribbean invention that the Spanish encountered in the early period of their exploration and introduced to European sailing, one of the few entirely positive contributions that the colonial encounter produced. It had real advantages. It swung with the motion of the ship rather than against it, which made sleeping in rough weather dramatically more manageable than lying on a fixed surface. It was easy to stow during the day. It was, if you were the sole occupant, reasonably comfortable for a man who had been awake for 16 hours and didn't have particularly high expectations. The problem was that everyone aboard was operating under the same constraints, which meant that hammock space was allocated on the same basis as everything else: seniority, relationship to the officers, and how much trouble you were willing to make about it. The lower decks where the crew slept offered no ventilation worth mentioning. What air came in came through gun ports when they were open, which they weren't during bad weather, or through the gratings in the deck above, which allowed light and air in fair conditions and a column of cold water during rain. The temperature below decks fluctuated between stuffy and suffocating in tropical latitudes and shockingly cold in the North Atlantic. Neither condition was described approvingly by anyone who experienced them. The smell was a subject that contemporary accounts approached with a certain poetic evasiveness. Phrases like disagreeable and most offensive appear repeatedly, which, when translated from the polite language of the era, means it was genuinely difficult to breathe. Sleep itself, under these conditions, was a negotiation. The ship was never silent. It creaked, groaned, and spoke in a continuous low register that experienced sailors could interpret for information about weather and the ship's condition. Men were constantly moving above and below decks as watch rotations changed every 4 hours. If you were lucky, you slept through the watch changes. If you weren't, you were part of a watch, which meant 4 hours on and 4 hours off, a pattern that produced a particular kind of cumulative exhaustion that never quite resolved itself because you never slept long enough to fully recover. Over weeks at sea, this built into something that sat behind the eyes like a low continuous pressure. Everyone was tired. Everyone was always tired. The men who appeared most alert and functional were simply those who had been tired for longer and had adjusted their baseline accordingly. You will reach that point eventually. Give it about 3 weeks. You are hungry. This is going to be your default condition for the foreseeable future. The food situation aboard a pirate ship was best described as a negotiation between what was theoretically edible and what you were willing to tolerate when the alternative was starvation. Fresh provisions lasted perhaps a week out of port before things began their inevitable decline. After that, you were eating hardtack, dense biscuits baked so dry they could survive a maritime disaster, which was the whole point, and salt pork that had been packed in barrels so long. The brine had turned the colour and consistency of something you'd find at the bottom of a pond. The hardtack had weevils in it. Everyone knew about the weevils. The accepted practice was to tap the biscuit on a hard surface to knock them out before eating, and if you were particularly hungry or particularly tired, to simply not look too closely. Salt pork and hardtack formed the backbone of the pirate diet in a way that the word backbone doesn't adequately convey. They weren't meals in any recognizable sense. They were caloric delivery systems, designed to keep a man functional rather than satisfied, and they accomplished this with the minimum possible investment in taste, texture, or the general experience of eating. The salt pork came from barrels that were repacked and rebrined repeatedly, and by the time you encountered it, the meat had been in some form of preservation for long enough that its original identity was largely theoretical. You ate it because it contained protein. You ate the hardtack because it contained carbohydrates. Your body processed both with the grim pragmatism of an organism that understood it had no better options. When a ship took a prize, a captured merchant vessel, the food stored in its hold was often the most genuinely exciting part of the plunder. Fresh cheese, dried fruit, barrels of decent wine, preserved meats that hadn't yet crossed the line into something concerning, these were celebrated. Aboard Bartholomew Roberts's ships, a captured vessel's food stores were reportedly distributed to the crew with the same enthusiasm usually reserved for gold. After weeks of hardtack and reconstituted salt pork, a piece of actual cheese represented a quality of life improvement that money could not accurately quantify. Cooking was done over an open fire in the ship's galley, a brick or iron hearth mounted on a bed of sand to reduce fire risk on a wooden vessel packed with gunpowder. The cook was frequently a man who had been injured enough to be unfit for regular duties, but not enough to be put ashore, a one-legged man in a hot, smoke-filled box at the front of the ship, responsible for translating bad ingredients into something the crew would eat without open complaint. It was not a prestigious role. It was not a well-loved role, but it was a necessary one, and crews that lost their cook to illness or injury felt the absence in immediate and practical ways. You ate what he produced, twice a day, in the same wooden bowl you used for everything, and you did not complain about it within earshot of anyone who had been at sea longer than you. That was the rule, unwritten but understood. Somewhere in the hold, there are barrels of drinking water. This sounds like good news. It is not. Fresh water stored in wooden barrels aboard a ship begins its transformation almost immediately. Within days, it develops a greenish tint and a smell that can most charitably be described as assertive. Within weeks, it has become a living ecosystem. Algae, bacteria, and microscopic organisms you have no name for, all quietly thriving in what is nominally your drinking supply. The solution, as with most liquid-related problems of the era, was rum. Not because pirates were constitutionally opposed to hydration, but because rum mixed with water, or even just rum consumed instead of water, was considerably safer than drinking the water on its own. Your daily ration of grog, which was rum watered down to something theoretically manageable, was one of the few reliable pleasures of shipboard life, and on a bad day, one of the only things standing between you and a serious waterborne illness. The grog ration was serious business. It was administered at set times, measured carefully by the quartermaster, and its reduction was among the most reliable methods of generating genuine crew discontent. A captain who cut the rum ration for disciplinary purposes was a captain who had decided that the disciplinary problem he was addressing was less serious than the new disciplinary problem he was about to create. Accounts of pirate crews making decisions, including some very bad decisions, while substantially under the influence of rum, appear throughout the historical record with a frequency that suggests the alcohol content of daily life at sea was considerably higher than modern workplace standards would accommodate. Rain was collected whenever possible. Sails were rigged to funnel rainwater into barrels during storms, and a good rainstorm in the tropics could replenish a ship's water supply meaningfully. This created a relationship with weather that was more nuanced than simple fear. Heavy rain was dangerous for sailing, but welcome for drinking, and the crew's reaction to an incoming storm contained a mixture of apprehension and optimism that was specific to people who were simultaneously worried about capsizing and running out of clean water. You developed this relationship quickly. By your second week at sea, you were checking the sky not just for weather, but for precipitation, calculating in some back part of your mind how long the current water supply would last and whether the clouds on the horizon looked promising. What you were not doing, what no one on this ship was doing, was maintaining adequate hydration by any measure a modern physician would recognize. The combination of physical labor, tropical heat, inadequate water, and daily rum consumption produced a baseline state that would be described today as chronic mild dehydration, expressed as persistent headaches, reduced cognitive function, and a general physical irritability that everyone attributed to the conditions of the life rather than the specific condition of not drinking enough water. This was not wrong, exactly. The conditions of the life were genuinely bad, but the dehydration wasn't helping. Here is something genuinely surprising about pirate ships. They were, in a peculiar and heavily armed way, democratic. The captain was elected by the crew. He could also be removed by the crew, a fact that every captain was extremely aware of at all times. His authority was largely absolute during battle or pursuit, but in calmer waters, decisions about where to sail, whether to attack a particular target, and how to distribute the plunder were subject to vote. The quartermaster, a rank unique to pirate ships, was elected separately and served as a counterweight to the captain's power, managing the crew's interests with the political instincts of a union representative who also carried a cutlass. This system sounds admirably progressive until you remember that the entire organization was built around armed robbery and that disagreements were resolved less through procedure and more through whoever remained standing afterward. The captain's role was primarily tactical. In a chase or a fight, His word was law, not because the crew had become temporarily authoritarian, but because split-second decisions in combat required a single voice, and there was no time for a show of hands. Captains who excelled in these moments built reputations that protected them during quieter periods, when the crew's patience with leadership was more negotiable. Captains who made poor tactical decisions found that the crew's memory was detailed and unforgiving. Bartholomew Roberts was reportedly an effective battle captain, in large part because his crew trusted that his decisions would result in successful plunder rather than unnecessary casualties, a track record that kept him in command far longer than charisma alone would have managed. The quartermaster was, in many ways, the more powerful figure in daily life. He allocated food and water. He assigned berths and duties. He represented the crew in disputes with the captain. He inspected prizes when a ship was taken, making sure the plunder was catalogued accurately before distribution, which required both mathematical competence and a personality capable of persuading an armed crew that the accounting was honest. It was a job that required the skills of an accountant, a diplomat, and occasionally a bouncer. Finding men with all three qualities was not always straightforward. Captains were voted out with some regularity. The reasons varied: poor performance in combat, bad navigation decisions that left the crew short of provisions, personal behavior that the crew found objectionable, or simply a loss of confidence that accumulated over time until someone called for a vote and the numbers weren't there. Some captains accepted removal with equanimity and returned to sailing as ordinary crew members. Some did not accept it equanimously, which created situations that the articles had anticipated poorly. A removed captain with a faction of supporters aboard a ship in the middle of the ocean was a specific kind of governance crisis, and the solutions available set him adrift, confine him, try to talk through the disagreement. Each had significant drawbacks that the crew was usually working through under some time pressure. The romantic version of becoming a pirate involves a dramatic personal choice, a moment of defiance, a turning away from a corrupt world, a man staring out at the horizon and deciding freedom was worth the risk. The actual version involved being captured. The majority of pirates in the Golden Age were former merchant sailors or naval men who had been taken by a pirate crew and given a very clear set of options. Option 1. Join. Option 2. Be set adrift, or worse. Faced with this particular fork in the road, a remarkable number of men discovered previously untapped enthusiasm for the pirating life. Some joined willingly and loudly, immediately adopting the culture with the energy of a new employee desperate to make a good impression. Others went quietly along and spent years maintaining that they were there under duress, a claim that was sometimes true and sometimes a useful legal fiction in the event of capture. The process of taking crew from a captured vessel followed certain informal conventions. The pirates would ask, sometimes politely, sometimes at knife point, who among the captured crew wished to join. Skilled men were specifically recruited. Carpenters, surgeons, navigators, and experienced gunners were valuable enough that their recruitment crossed the line from invitation to something closer to compulsion. A pirate ship without a carpenter was a ship that would eventually develop a fatal maintenance problem. A pirate ship without a navigator was a ship that would eventually sail somewhere it had not intended to go. The men who possessed these skills found their expertise transformed, without warning, from an asset into a reason they were not being given a choice. The men who joined voluntarily came from a specific set of conditions. Royal Navy service in the early 18th century was, by any reasonable standard, appalling. Pay arrived months or years late, if it arrived at all. Flogging was administered for offences that would not have merited a written warning in any other employment context. Captains held near absolute power over their crews and exercised it with varying degrees of sanity. Food and water conditions were not substantially better than those on pirate ships, with the additional disadvantage that you had signed up for this voluntarily and could be hanged for attempting to leave. A man who had spent 3 years in the Royal Navy and encountered a pirate crew that offered democratic governance, equal shares, and rum was encountering something that compared favourably to his current situation in ways that were difficult to argue with. Once aboard, Integration into the crew happened through the mechanisms of shared work and shared danger that have governed military and maritime organizations throughout history. You proved yourself by doing your job competently, by not complaining in ways that drew negative attention, by contributing to the social life of the crew, the songs, the gambling, the telling of stories in the evenings, and by demonstrating in the moments that mattered that you were someone the crew could rely on. The men who had joined under duress and the men who had joined enthusiastically became, over the months, largely indistinguishable in their daily behavior. Shared conditions produce shared identities, and the identity of a pirate crew was specific and coherent enough that it absorbed most individuals who spent sufficient time inside it. Someone on this ship has to know where you're going. Ideally, that person is not you, because navigation in the early 18th century was a skill that sat somewhere between applied mathematics and educated guessing. The basic tools were a compass, a quadrant for measuring the angle of the sun or stars above the horizon, and a log line, a piece of rope with knots tied at regular intervals that was thrown off the back of the ship to measure speed. From these instruments, a skilled navigator could calculate latitude with reasonable accuracy. Longitude was another matter entirely. The mathematics for determining east-west position at sea had not yet been solved in any reliable way, which meant that a significant portion of pirate navigation involved sailing to a known latitude and then heading east or west until something recognizable appeared on the horizon. This method worked often enough to not be abandoned, and failed often enough to account for a considerable number of ships that were never heard from again. The latitude calculation worked by measuring the angle of the sun above the horizon at local noon using the quadrant, later replaced by the sextant, which was more accurate and considerably easier to use in rough weather. From this angle, a navigator could determine how far north or south of the equator the ship was sitting. This required clear skies, which the Caribbean and Atlantic obliged with reasonable frequency but not reliably. An overcast week at sea meant a week of not knowing your latitude with any confidence, which meant a week of guessing, adjusting, and hoping that your estimate of how far the current and wind had pushed you sideways of your intended course was approximately correct. Coastal navigation was more forgiving. Known landmarks, soundings of the sea floor depth, the color of the water, the presence of certain birds that didn't venture far from land, all of these were read by experienced navigators as a continuous text describing where the ship was relative to the nearest shore. A navigator who knew the Caribbean well could operate with reasonable confidence along familiar routes, using knowledge that was part intuition and part accumulated observation. Navigating unfamiliar coastlines was a different problem, approached with more caution, more soundings, and more lookouts posted to watch for the reefs that surrounded most Caribbean islands, and had the maritime equivalent of a hair trigger. Charts existed, but their accuracy varied enormously. A chart of a well-travelled stretch of the Spanish Main might be reasonably reliable. A chart of a less visited coastline might be decades out of date, based on a single survey of uncertain quality, or simply wrong in ways that the cartographer had not had the opportunity to discover because he had not survived the discovery. Pirates collected charts the way they collected everything else, by taking them from captured vessels, and a navigator who accumulated a good collection of working charts for the waters he frequented had a genuinely valuable professional asset. Bartholomew Roberts reportedly considered a comprehensive set of navigation charts more valuable than most of the cash he took from his prizes. This was the assessment of a man who had spent several years trying to find specific locations in the Atlantic from a moving platform without the tools to know exactly where he was, and who had learned through experience exactly how much a good chart was worth. You've survived the food, the water, the hammock, and your new colleagues. Now the sky is doing something alarming. Weather at sea in the Caribbean and Atlantic was not the politely inconvenient kind that delays a picnic. It was the kind that came without warning, turned the sky a color that had no business appearing in nature, and reminded every person aboard that the ocean was not a road. It was a living thing with no particular interest in your survival. Storms could materialize within hours, driving winds that snapped masts and tore sails into rags. Hurricanes, which the Caribbean produced with cheerful regularity between June and November, could reduce a well-armed pirate sloop to floating debris in an afternoon. The crew's response to incoming bad weather involved a combination of frantic physical labor, taking in sails, lashing down everything that could move, pumping out rising bilge water, and something that can only be described as collective bargaining with the universe. Reading the weather was a skill as important as navigation and considerably less amenable to instruments. Barometric pressure, which would eventually provide reliable warning of incoming storms, was understood in principle but not yet systematically used by working sailors. What they had instead was a detailed accumulated knowledge of the signs, the particular color of the sunset, the behavior of seabirds, the feel of the wind shifting direction, the specific character of the swell that arrived ahead of a significant storm. A sailor with 20 years of Atlantic experience could read these signs with a reliability that modern meteorologists find genuinely impressive when they encounter it described in historical records. A sailor with 3 months of Atlantic experience was hoping that the men around him knew what they were doing. A full storm at sea was an experience that the language of the era struggled to convey. Every contemporary account reaches for the word terrible and then apologizes for its inadequacy. Waves that were taller than the mast, winds that made standing upright on deck impossible, the continuous roar of water and wind that made shouted orders inaudible 3 feet from the person giving them. In these conditions, the crew worked by proximity and gesture, lashing themselves to the ship to avoid being swept over the side, handling ropes that had stiffened with spray and tension into something that required full body weight to move. Men were sometimes swept overboard during storms, and the standard response, the hard, terrible calculus of seamanship, was that a man overboard in those conditions was gone, and stopping the ship to look for him would likely cost more lives than it saved. After a serious storm, the ship needed assessment. Masts were inspected for cracks. Rigging was replaced where it had parted. Sails were patched or condemned. The hull was pumped, and the rate of water ingress measured against the previous baseline to determine whether the storm had opened new seams. All of this was done by men who were exhausted, soaked, and in some cases injured, working with materials that were already compromised before the storm began. There was no dry dock waiting. There was no repair yard over the horizon. There was the ship, the sea, the crew, and whatever tools and materials happened to be in the hold. You fixed what you could fix with what you had, and you sailed on, and you tried not to think too carefully about the things you hadn't been able to fix. Here is something genuinely surprising about pirate ships. They were, in a peculiar and heavily armed way, democratic. The captain was elected by the crew. He could also be removed by the crew, a fact that every captain was extremely aware of at all times. His authority was largely absolute during battle or pursuit, but in calmer waters, decisions about where to sail, whether to attack a particular target, and how to distribute the plunder were subject to vote. The quartermaster, a rank unique to pirate ships, was elected separately and served as a counterweight to the captain's power, managing the crew's interests with the political instincts of a union representative who also carried a cutlass. This system sounds admirably progressive until you remember that the entire organization was built around armed robbery and that disagreements were resolved less through procedure and more through whoever remained standing afterward. The captain's role was primarily tactical. In a chase or a fight, his word was law, not because the crew had become temporarily authoritarian, but because split-second decisions in combat required a single voice, and there was no time for a show of hands. Captains who excelled in these moments built reputations that protected them during quieter periods, when the crew's patience with leadership was more negotiable. Captains who made poor tactical decisions found that the crew's memory was detailed and unforgiving. Bartholomew Roberts was reportedly an effective battle captain, in large part because his crew trusted his decisions would result in successful plunder rather than unnecessary casualties, a track record that kept him in command far longer than charisma alone would have managed. The quartermaster was, in many ways, the more powerful figure in daily life. He allocated food and water, he assigned berths and duties. He represented the crew in disputes with the captain. He inspected prizes when a ship was taken, making sure the plunder was catalogued accurately before distribution, which required mathematical competence and a personality capable of persuading an armed crew that the accounting was honest. It was a job that required the skills of an accountant, a diplomat, and occasionally a bouncer. Finding men with all three qualities was not always straightforward. Captains were voted out with some regularity. The reasons varied. Poor combat performance, bad navigation decisions, personal behavior the crew found objectionable, or simply a loss of confidence that accumulated until someone called for a vote and the numbers weren't there. Some captains accepted removal and returned to sailing as ordinary crew members. Others did not accept it gracefully, which created situations the articles had anticipated poorly. A removed captain with a faction of supporters aboard a ship in the middle of the ocean was a specific kind of governance crisis, and the available solutions, set him adrift, confine him, attempt negotiation, each had significant drawbacks that the crew was usually working through under considerable time pressure. What made this system remarkable wasn't that it worked perfectly. It didn't. Mutinies happened, factions formed, votes were intimidated. Captains clung to power past the point where the crew had clearly indicated they wanted a change. But compared to the alternatives available to working men in the early 18th century, the pirate model of governance was genuinely radical. A merchant sailor had no vote on anything. A Royal Navy sailor could be flogged for expressing an opinion his captain found inconvenient. A pirate could stand up at a crew meeting and argue that the captain's plan was bad, and if enough men agreed with him, the captain's plan changed. This was not democracy as any political philosopher would have recognized it, but it was something, and in an era when most working men had nothing, something was not nothing. The system was imperfect, violent, and held together largely by shared financial interest, but it held. The popular image of a pirate battle involves elegant swordplay, dramatic boarding actions, and combatants who seem to have attended some kind of choreography school. The reality was closer to controlled chaos performed by men who were tired, possibly drunk, and operating on a ship that was actively rolling beneath them. The preferred pirate strategy was not to fight at all. A well-timed warning shot across the bow of a merchant vessel, combined with a threatening flag and the visible presence of a large, agitated crew, was frequently enough to prompt immediate surrender. Merchants were not paid to die for their cargo. When fighting did occur, it was loud, close, and brief. Pistols were fired once and then used as clubs, because reloading under combat conditions was essentially impossible. Cutlasses, the short, heavy, curved swords associated with pirates, were practical precisely because there was no room for a proper sword swing on a crowded deck. The cannon was the primary instrument of persuasion before boarding. Pirate gunners aimed not to sink a target. A sunken ship was a wasted prize, but to disable it. The goal was to destroy the rigging, cut the masts, tear the sails, snap the lines that controlled the ship's movement. A merchant vessel that couldn't maneuver and couldn't run was a merchant vessel that was going to have a conversation about terms. Chain shot, 2 cannonballs connected by a length of chain, was particularly effective for this purpose. It tumbled through the air in a rotating arc and shredded rigging with a mechanical enthusiasm that ordinary cannonballs couldn't match. Grape shot, a cluster of small iron balls packed together, was used against personnel on deck at close range. The transition from rigging fire to grape shot was a signal to everyone present that the conversation had moved into its final phase. Boarding was the most dangerous part. Grappling hooks were thrown to pull the ships together, and then men went across, over the rails, through the gun ports, up the sides, into whatever was waiting for them on the other deck. Boarding actions were short because they had to be. 2 crews fighting in a confined space with edged weapons and pistols could not sustain combat for long before the casualty rate made the whole operation economically counterproductive. Pirates who took serious losses boarding a prize had won in the narrowest possible sense and lost in the practical one. Every man who died in a boarding action was a man whose share of the plunder reverted to the common fund, which was cold comfort to the man in question. Blackbeard understood the psychology of combat better than most. Before an engagement, he reportedly stuck slow-burning cannon fuses into his hair and beard and lit them so that smoke curled around his face during battle. This was not a practical military tactic. It was theatre, deliberate, calculated theatre, designed to make the men on the receiving end believe they were fighting something that was not entirely human. It worked often enough that he kept doing it. The lesson, which other captains also understood to varying degrees, was that the battle was frequently won or lost before the first shot was fired. In the minds of the men who were about to decide whether resistance was worth what it would cost them, a crew that had already decided it wasn't worth it surrendered. A crew that had decided it was worth it fought, and fighting was expensive for everyone, so you made them decide it wasn't worth it before it came to that. That was the job. The black flag, the skull and crossbones. Before you dismiss it as theatrical, understand that the pirate flag was one of the most effective pieces of psychological marketing in the history of conflict. Different pirate captains flew different variations. Blackbeard had a skeleton toasting the devil, Bartholomew Roberts flew a figure standing on two skulls, but the message was consistent: we are pirates. We intend to take your ship, and your options are to surrender immediately or make this considerably worse for everyone. The flag was flown only at the moment of attack, often after the pirates had spent hours approaching under a false flag, a naval practice so common it had its own etiquette. Flying another nation's colours to close the distance on a target, then revealing the true flag at the last possible moment, was considered perfectly acceptable by the standards of the era. Running up the black flag at close range, on the other hand, was the pirate equivalent of a final offer. The name Jolly Roger is itself somewhat mysterious. Various etymologies have been proposed, from the French Joli Rouge, meaning pretty red, referring to an earlier red flag tradition, from the Tamil Ali Raja, meaning king of the sea, from the English use of Roger as a slang term for a wandering vagabond. None of these has been conclusively established, which is appropriate for a flag whose entire purpose was to project menace while obscuring information. What is known is that the black flag became standardized enough by the early 18th century that its appearance on the horizon was immediately understood by every sailor in the Atlantic world. You did not need to be close enough to read the specific design. You needed only to see the color. The choice of imagery on individual flags was deliberate and meaningful within the culture. Hourglasses appeared frequently. Time is running out. Skeletons appeared. Death is coming. Swords, spears, and bleeding hearts appeared. We are serious about this. Bartholomew Roberts' flag, which showed him standing on two skulls labelled ABH and AMH, a Barbadian's head and a Martinican's head, was a specific political statement about his hostility toward the governors of those islands who had pursued him. It was, in the vocabulary of modern branding, targeted messaging. He knew who he was angry at, and he wanted them to know he knew. The red flag, sometimes called the bloody flag or no quarter, was the alternative and considerably more alarming signal. Where the black flag meant surrender and live, the red flag meant the offer of quarter had been withdrawn. Its appearance after the black flag had been ignored was the maritime equivalent of a final warning that had run out. Some crews flew it immediately, without the preliminary black flag, as a statement of intent that left no room for negotiation. This was considered aggressive even by the standards of people who made their living through armed robbery at sea. The flag you chose to fly and the sequence in which you flew it told the target everything about your intentions and your patience. Most targets, upon seeing the black flag appear at close range after an approach they had not had time to respond to, made the correct assessment of their options and reached for the white one. Here is the uncomfortable arithmetic of piracy. Most of what pirates stole was not treasure. It was cargo. Cloth, food, rope, timber, tobacco, sugar, navigational instruments, gunpowder, and above all, the ships themselves. These were the actual prizes of the golden age of piracy. Chests of gold and silver existed, but they were comparatively rare. The Spanish treasure fleets that carried New World silver back to Europe were heavily armed, heavily escorted, and extremely difficult to take. Most pirates targeted merchant vessels precisely because they weren't heavily armed, which meant most pirate prizes were full of goods that then had to be sold. Selling stolen goods required a buyer, which required a port that asked limited questions, which meant pirates needed friendly territory, a safe harbour where a man could unload a hold full of suspiciously unmarked cloth without encountering a representative of any particular crown. The economics of plunder were more complicated than the legend suggests. A successful prize had to be assessed, its contents catalogued, and a value assigned to everything in the hold before distribution could happen. This was the quartermaster's job, and it required both competence and the kind of unimpeachable personal integrity that was in short supply on a ship full of men who had signed up specifically because they found conventional honesty financially unrewarding. Items of obvious value, coin, jewelry, navigational instruments, weapons, were straightforward. Bulk cargo was more complex. The value of a hold full of raw sugar depended entirely on where and to whom you could sell it, and a price agreed upon at sea might look very different once you arrived at port and discovered that the market had moved. Ships themselves were often the most valuable prizes. A well-built, well-maintained vessel in good sailing condition was worth substantially more than whatever cargo it happened to be carrying. Pirates who took a good ship faced a decision: keep it, sell it, or strip it for parts. Keeping it meant a larger fleet and more capacity for plunder, but also more crew to feed, pay, and manage. Selling it meant a lump sum payment from a buyer who was almost certainly going to ask some pointed questions about provenance and receive some answers that everyone present would agree to treat as satisfactory. Stripping it for parts meant taking the sails, rigging, anchors, cannons, and anything else useful before abandoning the hull, a slower process that yielded practical materials rather than cash. The men who benefited most from piracy were frequently not the pirates themselves. Port merchants who bought stolen cargo at a fraction of its value and sold it at market price made reliable, largely risk-free profits from the entire enterprise. Corrupt colonial officials who accepted bribes to look away from suspicious transactions accumulated wealth without leaving the comfort of their offices. Legitimate trading companies found their Caribbean routes disrupted and their insurance premiums rising, an indirect cost they passed along to customers at the other end of the supply chain. Piracy was an economic system as much as it was a criminal enterprise, with beneficiaries and victims distributed across the Atlantic world in patterns that the simple narrative of brave pirates versus evil empires doesn't adequately capture. You were the front end of a supply chain that you would never fully see, stealing things for people you would never meet, at risks that they would never share. The golden age of piracy produced a small number of figures whose names have survived 3 centuries of retelling, and it's worth spending a moment with the gap between their legends and their actual situations. Blackbeard, Edward Teach, was a large, theatrically intimidating man who understood the value of reputation and cultivated it deliberately. He tied slow-burning fuses into his beard before battle so that smoke curled around his face, because he had correctly identified that looking like a demon was an effective negotiating tool. He was active for only about 2 years before being killed in 1718 during a naval engagement that he lost. Bartholomew Roberts, less famous but considerably more successful, captured over 400 vessels in a career that lasted from 1719 to 1722, a productivity rate that remains genuinely staggering by any measure. Blackbeard operated primarily along the American colonial coast and in the Caribbean, making his base at various points in North Carolina, where the colonial governor was either sympathetic to pirates or simply too poorly resourced to do anything effective about them. His fleet at its peak numbered several vessels and several hundred men. His personal reputation was cultivated so effectively that merchant crews sometimes surrendered without a shot, based solely on being informed who they were dealing with. He was killed in November of 1718 in a battle with a Royal Navy crew led by Lieutenant Robert Maynard in a shallow inlet off the North Carolina coast. A fight that was close enough and violent enough that accounts of it remain vivid 3 centuries later. He was reportedly shot 5 times and cut more than 20 times before he finally stopped. This was reported with what sounds like genuine astonishment by the men who killed him. Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, was a different kind of figure. Where Blackbeard was theatrical and physical, Roberts was methodical, prolific, and by contemporary accounts genuinely unusual in his personal habits. He didn't drink alcohol, preferring tea, which aboard an 18th century pirate ship was practically eccentric. He was reportedly well-dressed, articulate, and deeply committed to the articles he sailed under. He took more prizes than any other Golden Age pirate, more than 400 vessels in under 3 years, operating across the Caribbean, the West African coast, and the North Atlantic. He was killed in 1722 off the West African coast when a Royal Navy warship caught his crew largely incapacitated after a night of heavy drinking. Roberts himself was standing on deck when the first broadside hit and died almost immediately. It was, by the standards of how Golden Age pirates tended to end, a relatively quick conclusion to a career of extraordinary scale. Calico Jack, John Rackham, is remembered less for his operational achievements, which were modest, and more for the company he kept. His crew included Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and his capture in 1720 reportedly involved his men being too drunk to offer meaningful resistance, while the women aboard fought until they were physically restrained. He was hanged in Jamaica, and his body was displayed in a gibbet at a place subsequently known as Rackham's Cay, a location that was probably intended as a warning and has functioned primarily as a tourist landmark. These are the names that survived. For every pirate whose name history retained, there were dozens whose careers were equally eventful, and who died equally badly, and who are remembered by no one. The articles aboard most pirate ships explicitly prohibited women from being brought aboard, which historically has never stopped anyone from doing anything. Anne Bonny and Mary Read are the two most documented women of the Golden Age of piracy, and both served aboard pirate vessels with a level of competence that their male colleagues reportedly found either impressive or deeply destabilizing, depending on the individual. Anne Bonny joined the crew of her lover, Calico Jack Rackham, after leaving her husband in Nassau. Mary Read had been living as a man for portions of her earlier life, a survival strategy that was more common in the 18th century than history generally acknowledges. When Rackham's crew was captured in 1720, most of the men were reported to be too drunk to fight. Anne and Mary, according to accounts, were not among the incapacitated. Anne Bonny's path to piracy followed a route that was, for the era, almost logical in its progression. She had married a small-time sailor named James Bonny in the Bahamas, which was already the kind of decision that suggests a limited range of available options. When she encountered Calico Jack in Nassau's pirate-friendly taverns, she left her husband and joined his crew, an act that technically constituted a criminal offence under colonial law and practically constituted a significant upgrade in her circumstances. Given what we know about the relative qualities of James Bonny and John Rackham as life companions, she sailed as a full crew member, fought in engagements, and was reportedly well regarded by the crew in her capacity as someone you wanted beside you when things went sideways. Mary Read's story was stranger and, in its way, more revealing about the constraints that 18th century women navigated. She had been raised as a boy by her mother for reasons connected to inheritance law, worked as a soldier and later a merchant sailor in male clothing, and came to piracy through a route that had already involved more gender performance than most people manage in an entire lifetime. When her identity became known aboard Rackham's ship, the crew apparently adjusted with a pragmatism that speaks well of their priorities. She could sail, she could fight, and she didn't cause problems. Her gender was, in this context, less relevant than her competence. Both women were captured with Rackham's crew in October of 1720, tried in Jamaica, and sentenced to death. Both pleaded pregnancy, a legal maneuver that delayed execution. Mary Read died in prison, likely of fever, before her execution could be carried out. Anne Bonny's subsequent fate is genuinely unknown. Records stop, and history, which had tracked her with some interest up to that point, loses the thread entirely. She may have been ransomed by her father, who had the connections and the financial means to make that happen. She may have died in prison, She may have lived out a long, quiet, entirely undocumented life somewhere in the colonial Atlantic world, which would be, in its own way, the most satisfying ending available. The historical record declines to say, and the silence is its own kind of story about how thoroughly women could disappear from history even when they had been, briefly, impossible to ignore. Let's say something goes wrong. Let's say you take a cutlass across the forearm during a boarding action, or you develop a persistent fever somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, or the weeks of salt pork and hardtack catch up with your teeth in ways that cannot be ignored. You need medical attention. What you have is the ship's surgeon, if your crew had one, which many did not, a man whose qualifications ranged from genuine naval training to having once watched someone else perform an amputation and felt he had a general sense of the procedure. The ship's medicine chest contained items that were, by the standards of the era, considered effective: rum for anesthetic purposes, tar for sealing wounds, various herbal preparations of uncertain efficacy. Scurvy was the real epidemic of long sea voyages, a vitamin C deficiency that caused gums to bleed, teeth to loosen, joints to swell, and in its later stages, a general physical collapse that was as miserable as it sounds. Amputation was the standard response to a serious wound of the arm or leg, not because surgeons were cavalier about removing limbs, but because a wound that had become infected in the pre-antibiotic era was a wound that would kill the patient through a process considerably slower and more unpleasant than the surgery. The operation was performed as quickly as possible because speed reduced blood loss and also reduced the duration of the patient's consciousness during a procedure conducted without effective anesthesia. Rum was administered in quantities intended to dull the experience rather than eliminate it, which is a distinction that patients reportedly found unsatisfying. The saw was the primary instrument. The whole procedure, performed by a competent surgeon, could take under a minute. The subsequent survival rate depended on infection, the patient's overall health, and factors that nobody at the time could identify or control. Fever was the other great killer. Malaria, yellow fever, typhoid, and various other illnesses that 18th century medicine grouped under the general heading of fever accounted for more pirate deaths than combat by a considerable margin. Tropical waters were beautiful and genuinely, lethally dangerous to the health of men who had no immunity to the diseases that circulated there. Yellow fever in particular killed with a speed and thoroughness that made combat casualties look manageable by comparison. An outbreak aboard ship could reduce a crew of 80 men to a barely functional skeleton within weeks. The treatment, rest, fluids when available, and prayers addressed the symptoms about as effectively as you would expect. Skilled surgeons were recruited with the same enthusiasm pirates applied to skilled navigators and carpenters. The articles of several documented pirate crews specified an enhanced compensation package for the ship's surgeon, extra shares, guaranteed protection, sometimes a specific provision that he would not be compelled to participate in combat. This was enlightened self-interest, of the most practical kind. A crew that killed or abused its surgeon was a crew that would subsequently deal with its medical problems through improvisation, which historically produced outcomes that were both creative and grim. The surgeon knew this. The crew knew this. The arrangement functioned on the understanding that certain people were too useful to mistreat, a principle that, had it been applied more broadly throughout the golden age of piracy, might have substantially changed the historical record. Nassau, in the Bahamas, was the closest thing the golden age of piracy had to a home base, a chaotic, loosely governed port that at its peak in the early 1700s housed an estimated 2,000 pirates, and a much smaller number of people who were there for legitimate reasons and deeply regretted it. The governor, or the absence of any effective governor, was the key feature. Nassau operated in a legal grey zone where the local authorities were either sympathetic to pirates, actively in business with them, or simply outnumbered. Taverns, provisioning merchants, ship repairers, and the various individuals who managed the sale of stolen goods operated openly. Then, in 1718, the British Crown sent Woodes Rogers as the new governor of the Bahamas, with a pardon in one hand and a fleet in the other. Rogers arrived at Nassau in July of 1718 and found a harbour full of pirate vessels and a town that had developed, over the preceding years, the particular character of a place where the normal rules had been suspended long enough that people had stopped expecting them to return. He offered the pardon to anyone who would take it. Most did, including some significant figures of the Golden Age, who accepted the pardon with every appearance of sincerity and varying degrees of actual commitment. Those who refused, most notably Charles Vane, who fired a broadside in Rogers' direction as a statement of his position on the matter and sailed out of the harbour under fire, were declared pirates and pursued. Rogers hanged several men who had taken the pardon and then relapsed, doing it publicly and in numbers large enough to make the point clearly. Nassau's days as a pirate republic were over. The town became, over the following years, a legitimate colonial port, which was considerably safer and considerably less interesting. Tortuga, off the northern coast of Hispaniola, had served a similar function in an earlier era, a buccaneer stronghold that operated with French tolerance as a base for operations against Spanish shipping. By the early 1700s it was less significant, but the model it represented, a poorly governed island with a sheltered harbour and flexible local authorities, was replicated in various forms across the Caribbean. Governors who supplemented their official salaries with unofficial payments from pirates in exchange for looking away from certain activities were common enough that the Crown spent considerable energy trying to identify and replace them, with limited success given the communication delays of the era. Port Royal in Jamaica had been the most notorious pirate haven of the late 17th century, before an earthquake in 1692 dropped 2/3 of it into the sea, an event that contemporaries interpreted as divine judgment, with a unanimity that suggests they had not been unaware of the town's reputation. The rebuilt Port Royal was considerably more respectable, but the taverns that lined its waterfront continued to provide the services that waterfront taverns have always provided to men returning from extended periods at sea, with money in their pockets and limited interest in moderation. You ended up in these places eventually, everyone did. The combination of prize money, rum, and relief at being alive produced a financial enthusiasm that the town's merchants had organised their entire economy around servicing. By 1718, the golden age of piracy had become expensive enough that the British government decided to do something about it. The solution was the King's Pardon, a general amnesty offered to any pirate who surrendered themselves to a Crown representative and swore off piracy. It was a genuinely clever piece of policy. Some pirates took it immediately and gratefully, retired to quiet lives, and were never heard from again. Some took it, went straight for a few months, and then went back to sea, sometimes multiple times. Some, like Blackbeard, accepted the pardon, resumed piracy within weeks, and apparently considered the whole thing a brief administrative interruption. The pardon created a wedge in pirate crews between those who wanted out and those who didn't, and it gave the Crown a legal mechanism to execute anyone who refused it with a clean conscience. The pardon was formally known as the Act for the Suppression of Piracy, passed by Parliament in 1718, and it offered a genuine clean slate to anyone who presented themselves to a Crown authority before September of that year. The crimes covered were comprehensive. Whatever you had done, wherever you had done it, the pardon covered it, with the specific exception of crimes committed against British subjects in the previous year, a carve-out that was probably intended to limit the Crown's exposure to compensation claims, and which most pirates either didn't read carefully or decided to interpret optimistically. The decision to take the pardon was not simple. For men who had been at sea for years, who had committed acts that the law treated as capital offences, and that their own conscience may or may not have troubled them about, the pardon offered a return to legitimate society, if legitimate society would have them. Former pirates who settled in colonial ports found that their neighbours were aware of their histories and had opinions about those histories that ranged from admiring to hostile depending on the neighbour and the specific history. Employment options for a man known to have spent several years robbing ships were not unlimited. The skills of seamanship were genuinely valuable, and merchant companies hired former pirates, with some regularity, 20. Occasionally discovering that the experience of operating outside the law had not produced the kind of reliable deference to authority they had been hoping for. Those who refused the pardon did so for reasons that varied from the principled to the practical. Some had genuinely embraced the pirate identity and found the offer of reintegration into a society they had deliberately rejected unappealing. Some had committed crimes specific enough and recent enough that they doubted the pardon's protection would hold in practice. Some were doing well enough that the risk calculation didn't favour surrender. And some, the category that included Charles Vane and a handful of others, were committed enough to the life that no offer from the Crown was going to change their calculus. These men continued operating in increasingly hostile waters, with shrinking safe harbours and growing naval attention, until they were caught or killed, which, with a consistency that retrospect makes look inevitable, they eventually were. Being a pirate in the early 1700s meant operating in a world where the naval response was, for a long time, genuinely inadequate. The Royal Navy was spread thin across the Atlantic and Caribbean, dealing with the aftermath of various European wars, and piracy, while costly, was not always the top priority. This changed. As the economic damage from piracy mounted and political pressure increased, dedicated anti-piracy operations became more common. HMS Pearl, HMS Rose, and a growing number of warships began specifically hunting pirate vessels. The difference in armament between a naval frigate and a pirate sloop was not subtle. Pirates relied on speed, surprise, and the fear generated by their reputation. In a straight fight with a determined naval vessel of comparable size, the outcomes were rarely encouraging. The calculus of engaging a naval warship was straightforward and unfavourable. A Royal Navy frigate was purpose-built for combat, crewed by men under strict military discipline, armed with cannons of larger calibre and greater number than most pirate vessels could match, and operating under orders that did not include the option of discretionary retreat. A pirate sloop had speed and manoeuvrability, which were decisive advantages in the right conditions: shallow water, proximity to coastline, favourable wind, and nearly useless in the wrong ones. When a naval frigate caught a pirate vessel in open water in a fair wind, the engagement was frequently brief and conclusive. Bartholomew Roberts' death in 1722 exemplified this. His crew was caught in deteriorating condition, his own ship outgunned, and the engagement lasted less than 2 hours before his death effectively ended organised resistance. Intelligence was the Navy's growing advantage. As colonial governors improved their networks of informants, and as former pirates took the pardon and shared what they knew in exchange for leniency, the Navy's knowledge of pirate routes, careening grounds, and safe harbours improved substantially. A pirate crew that had operated for months in a particular area relying on the obscurity of their locations began to find that the locations were less obscure than they had been. Ships that had been reliable safe harbours became places where naval vessels were waiting. The intelligence advantage compounded over time. Every captured crew provided information about other crews, and the golden age of piracy was a sufficiently small world that the connections between different captains and crews were dense enough that pulling on one thread tended to unravel several others. The psychological shift was perhaps as significant as the operational one. Piracy in the early 1700s had operated in an environment where the costs of the life were partially offset by the genuine possibility of operating indefinitely without consequences. By 1722, that possibility had contracted substantially. The men who had defined the Golden Age were dead, captured, or retired. The safe harbours had closed or been compromised. The Navy was present in numbers and with a level of operational focus that made the risk calculation look much worse than it had 5 years earlier. The Golden Age didn't end with a single dramatic confrontation. It ended with the slow withdrawal of the conditions that had made it possible, the quiet closing of doors, one by one, until the room was too small to operate in. The question of pirate violence is more complicated than the legend suggests, and also considerably more unpleasant. Pirates had a professional interest in their reputation for brutality, because a reputation for brutality made ships surrender without a fight, which was safer and more efficient than actual combat. Some of this reputation was carefully cultivated theatre, theatrical cruelty performed in front of witnesses who would then spread the word. Some of it was entirely genuine. Captains who had mistreated their sailors found that those sailors, when they fell into pirate hands, were not protected by the general policy of non-violence towards surrendered crews. There are documented accounts of pirate crews torturing captains specifically reported to have been cruel to their men, a form of redistributive justice that was entirely consistent with pirate ideology, while remaining firmly in the category of things you would not enjoy being present for. The treatment of captured crews and captains depended heavily on how the surrender had gone and who the captain was. A merchant crew that had surrendered promptly, offered no resistance, and cooperated with the inventory of their cargo could reasonably expect to be released with their ship, or at least with their lives, within a day or two. Pirates who harmed cooperative surrendered crews were damaging their own operational effectiveness. Word travelled fast in the Atlantic world, and a reputation for killing people who surrendered peacefully made future targets fight rather than yield, which cost pirates lives and prizes. The threat of violence was a tool. Indiscriminate violence against cooperative targets was a tool being used incorrectly. Captains who had a reputation for mistreating their crews entered pirate captivity in a different category entirely. Edward Lowe, one of the more genuinely sadistic figures of the Golden Age, was known for torturing captains he encountered at sea, and contemporary accounts suggest he required little provocation. His cruise articles permitted a level of violence against captives that other pirate crews found excessive, which is a notable standard to have failed by. But even Lowe operated within a logic. The captains he targeted most ferociously were those reported by their own crews to have been brutal employers. This was not justice in any formal sense. It was closer to a message, a signal transmitted through the Atlantic merchant community that certain categories of behavior had acquired new consequences. Walking the plank, incidentally, almost certainly did not happen. It appears in no contemporary accounts and enters the popular mythology of piracy through 19th century fiction, where it was a dramatically convenient device that the actual pirates apparently never thought to employ, possibly because they were creative enough about their alternatives that a plank over the side seemed redundant. Marooning was real. Leaving a man on a sandbar or uninhabited island with a pistol and a single charge was a documented punishment for serious violations of the Articles. The pistol was understood to offer the marooned man a choice about how he preferred his situation to conclude. It was a punishment designed to be as grim as possible while maintaining a certain formal distance from outright execution, a distinction that the men on the receiving end probably found less meaningful than the men delivering it. The violence that defined the golden age of piracy was less dramatic than legend and more pervasive than the romantic version acknowledges. It was the low-level, constant threat that shaped every interaction, the awareness that the men around you were armed and had demonstrated a willingness to use force. The knowledge that the line between colleague and antagonist could shift in ways that were not always predictable. You lived inside that awareness, every day. Eventually you stopped noticing it, which was perhaps the most unsettling adaptation of all. You want to know where the treasure went. So does everyone. The romanticized image of pirates burying chests of gold on deserted islands is almost entirely fictional. A narrative device popularized by Robert Louis Stevenson's novel, published in 1883, that has proven extraordinarily resistant to correction. In practice, pirates spent their money. They spent it in port with an enthusiasm and velocity that suggested an awareness that they might not live long enough to require a retirement fund. Taverns, provisioning, new equipment, gambling, bribes to local officials, and the general expenses of maintaining a ship that was actively being used for crime all consumed plunder at a remarkable rate. Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful pirates of the era, died in combat aboard a ship that had been at sea for months and was, by that point, in need of extensive repairs. The distribution of plunder happened according to the Articles, which meant it happened with a level of procedural formality that sat oddly alongside the circumstances of its acquisition. The quartermaster inventoried the prize, Values were assigned, shares were calculated. Men received their portions in coin, in goods, or in some combination of the two, depending on what had been taken and what could be liquidated. A successful prize might mean each crew member received a meaningful sum, several months of what a merchant sailor would earn legitimately, sometimes considerably more. A string of unsuccessful weeks at sea, during which the ship had consumed provisions and the crew had consumed rum, and nothing of value had been taken, could leave men with nothing to show for their time and a growing impatience that captains managed with varying degrees of success. The money, once distributed, moved quickly. Port towns that served pirate crews had developed entire economies around the reliable appearance of men with sudden cash and limited interest in moderation. Tavern keepers, who occupied a position at the center of pirate social life that their medieval equivalents would have recognized immediately, set their prices accordingly. Gambling, officially prohibited by many ships' articles during the voyage, resumed the moment the crew set foot ashore with a pent-up enthusiasm that the prohibition had merely deferred. Women, accommodation, food that was not hardtack, rum that was not watered down, new clothing, weapons, and the various other things that men who had been at sea for months spent money on. All of these were available in port at prices calibrated to the customer's known financial condition and expected judgment. The deeper problem was structural. A pirate crew that had no money needed to take prizes to get money, which required the ship to be operational, which required provisions and maintenance, which required money. The cycle meant that successful plunder was consumed by the costs of the operation that had produced it, and that the window between a successful prize and the need for another one was shorter than the romantic version of the life suggested. Wealthy retired pirates existed, men who had accumulated enough, survived long enough, and been clever enough about preservation to arrive in middle age with something to show for it. But they were the exception. The majority of Golden Age pirates died in combat, at the end of a rope, or in circumstances that left them with nothing. The treasure was real. The part where anyone kept it was mostly fiction. Beyond the Jolly Roger, pirates developed a surprisingly sophisticated visual communication system built around the language of flags and signal guns. A black flag meant surrender now, and you will likely be treated reasonably. A red flag, which some crews flew as an alternative, meant something closer to no quarter, which in the vocabulary of the era meant that the offer of reasonable treatment had been withdrawn. The choice of which flag to fly, and when, was a tactical decision made in the moment based on whether the target appeared willing to comply or likely to fight. Ships exchanged identification signals, often codes that changed regularly, and a pirate crew that had recently taken a naval vessel might have current signal books that allowed them to impersonate legitimate shipping long enough to get close to another target. False colors, flying the flag of a nation you were not affiliated with, was a standard tactic used by naval vessels, privateers, and pirates alike. The rules of naval engagement in the early 18th century required only that a ship display its true colors before firing, a convention that was honored in the sense that pirates did indeed run up their true flag at the moment of attack. Having spent the preceding hours under whatever flag seemed most useful for closing the distance without alarming the target, a French flag was useful in waters where French shipping was common and English patrols were not. An English flag was useful for approaching English merchant vessels whose crews would not become alarmed until it was too late to do anything useful about it. Signal guns, single cannon shots fired in specific patterns, communicated information across distances where flags were too small to read. One shot might mean a friendly hail, 2 shots in succession might mean distress. The specific meanings varied by convention and era, and a pirate crew with current knowledge of naval signaling protocols could use this system to buy themselves critical minutes of approach time. The captured signal books of naval vessels were accordingly treated as genuinely valuable intelligence assets, studied and memorized by the crew's officers and replaced whenever a more current version could be obtained. The visual language of threat extended beyond flags. The arrangement of a ship's guns, run out through the gun ports versus secured inside, was visible at a distance and communicated intent clearly. A ship approaching with its gun ports closed was making a statement about its immediate intentions that a ship approaching with 20 cannons visible through open ports was not. Pirates sometimes kept their guns concealed until the last possible moment, presenting a less threatening profile to encourage targets to hold their course rather than run. The transition from concealed to revealed armament, combined with the appearance of the black flag, was designed to produce a moment of overwhelming psychological clarity in the minds of the target crew, the simultaneous realization that the threat was real, that it was close, and that the available response options had narrowed to approximately one. The crews of Golden Age pirate ships were genuinely multiracial in a way that was unusual for the era, and the question of what this meant in practice is one that historians have found genuinely complicated. Escaped enslaved people and free black sailors appear in pirate crew lists with regularity. Some served as full crew members with equal shares under the articles. Some were listed separately, with reduced shares or restricted roles. Some were re-enslaved when captured ships were taken. The picture is inconsistent, which is perhaps the most historically honest thing that can be said about it. Bartholomew Roberts flew one of his flags in protest over what he described as the oppressive conditions of the Barbados plantation system. This did not prevent his crew from capturing ships and their enslaved cargoes and selling them. The Atlantic world of the early 18th century was built on slavery in ways so fundamental that they shaped every institution, including the ones operating outside the law. Pirate ships existed within this world, not outside it. They drew their crews from the populations that the Atlantic economy had displaced, exploited, and discarded: former slaves, indentured servants, transported criminals, naval deserters, and merchant sailors who had decided that the legitimate version of maritime labor was insufficiently distinguishable from the illegitimate version to justify its lower returns. The presence of black sailors in these crews reflected both the genuine possibility of a different social arrangement aboard ship and the limits of how different that arrangement could be when the ship returned to a world that had not changed around it. Some documented cases are striking in their specificity. The crew of the pirate ship Wider, captained by Samuel Bellamy and sunk off Cape Cod in 1717, included men from West Africa, the Caribbean, and the American colonies sailing under articles that gave each man an equal share regardless of origin. The wreck, excavated beginning in the 1980s, has provided detailed physical evidence about who these men were, their personal effects, their tools, the objects they carried, that complicates any simple narrative about who became a pirate and why. They were not a uniform population. They were individuals who had arrived at the same ship from very different directions and for very different reasons. The historical record is incomplete in ways that reflect the incompleteness of the era's documentation. Enslaved and formerly enslaved people appear in trial records, ship manifests, and contemporary accounts primarily when their presence was legally significant, when they were being sold, when they were testifying, when they were being executed. The texture of daily life aboard a diverse pirate crew, the social dynamics of shared quarters and shared danger among men of different origins, is largely lost. What survives suggests a world that was neither the racial utopia that some romantic accounts have constructed, nor the straightforward extension of the slave society surrounding it. It was something in between, partial, contradictory, and shaped by the same forces that shaped everything else in the Atlantic world, including the men who chose to live outside its official rules while remaining, inevitably, inside its actual ones. Every ship had articles, but the actual daily behavioral standards aboard a pirate vessel were enforced by a set of norms that combined genuine practical necessity with what can only be described as a very specific pirate culture. Gambling was frequently banned, not because pirates were morally opposed to it, but because gambling debts created conflict, and conflict on a ship with 100 armed men was bad for everyone's health. Fighting aboard ship was regulated. Disputes were supposed to be settled on shore, in a duel, with witnesses under agreed terms. Lights out was enforced below decks after a certain hour. These rules existed because pirates knew from experience what happened when they didn't. Ships that descended into internal violence rarely made it to a profitable career. The dual provision in the Articles was one of the more formally structured elements of pirate governance, and also one of the more genuinely observed ones. When two men had a grievance that couldn't be resolved through discussion, which, given the personalities involved and the daily stresses of shipboard life, was not uncommon, the Articles provided a mechanism. They would be set ashore at the next landfall given pistols and allowed to resolve the matter. A second would be appointed for each man. The duel would proceed under agreed rules. The survivor would return to the ship, the matter would be considered closed, and both parties' shares would be distributed according to whichever outcome had occurred. This was, in its strange way, more procedurally fair than the justice available to most men in the societies the pirates had left, where disputes between men of different social stations were resolved entirely in favour of the higher-ranking party. Personal theft from shipmates was treated with particular severity. Stealing from a fellow crew member was a category of offence that the Articles distinguished sharply from the general business of stealing from everyone else, which was the entire point of the enterprise. The logic was coherent. The Articles divided the plunder fairly. Everyone received their share, and taking from a colleague outside that system was a violation of the social contract that held the crew together. Punishments for theft from shipmates ranged from marooning to being set adrift, and the consistency with which these punishments were applied suggests they were genuinely effective deterrents rather than theoretical provisions. Music played a role in maintaining crew morale that the formal Articles didn't capture, but that contemporary accounts mention consistently. Pirate ships carried musicians, typically fiddlers, sometimes drummers and pipers, whose function was to provide entertainment during the long stretches of the voyage when there was nothing to do, and the combination of confinement, boredom, and anxiety was beginning to produce the kind of low-level friction that escalated into larger problems. Bartholomew Roberts' Articles specifically provided that the ship's musician was entitled to rest on Sundays, a provision that suggests the musician had complained about working conditions and that someone with authority had agreed the complaint was reasonable. Even in the most anarchic organization the 18th century had to offer, someone still had to negotiate the musician's day off. The golden age of piracy is generally considered to have ended around 1726, and it didn't end with a single dramatic battle or a decisive act of law. It ended through a combination of factors that accumulated over time, like water finding its way through stone. The king's pardon pulled some men out, naval patrols killed others. The hanging of major figures, Blackbeard in 1718, Calico Jack in 1720, Bartholomew Roberts in 1722, removed the charismatic centres around which large crews had organised. Colonial ports that had once looked the other way began to enforce regulations, partly because legitimate trade was growing profitable enough that the risks of piracy association outweighed the benefits. And perhaps most practically, the supply of disaffected, displaced sailors willing to take the risk had begun to contract as post-war conditions stabilized. The War of the Spanish Succession, which ended in 1713, had released thousands of trained naval and privateering sailors into a peacetime economy that had no particular use for them. These men, skilled, experienced, accustomed to violence, and suddenly unemployed, formed the human raw material of the golden age of piracy. The timing was not coincidental. The surge in piracy that characterized the years between 1715 and 1722 was directly connected to the sudden availability of men who knew how to sail, how to fight, and how to organize themselves for maritime operations, and who found that the legitimate economy had very little to offer them by way of employment. When post-war economic conditions gradually stabilized and legitimate maritime employment became more available, the pipeline of recruits that had supplied the Golden Age began to run thinner. The legal infrastructure against piracy also improved significantly during this period. The admiralty courts that tried piracy cases became more efficient. Governors who had previously been indifferent or complicit were replaced with men who had both the motivation and the resources to enforce the law. The network of informants and former pirates who provided intelligence to naval commanders grew denser. The world that the Golden Age pirates had operated in, characterized by weak governance, overwhelmed naval resources, and ports where the question of how a cargo had been acquired was considered impolite, was closing around them as colonial administration matured and commercial interests that depended on secure shipping routes applied political pressure for enforcement. What remained after 1726 was piracy in other forms, in other waters, the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, the Mediterranean. But the specific phenomenon of the Golden Age, centered on the Caribbean and Atlantic and characterized by the democratic articles, the Jolly Roger, the specific captains and their specific careers, was over. It had lasted perhaps 15 years at its most intense. In those 15 years, it had disrupted Atlantic trade sufficiently to force institutional responses that reshaped colonial governance, naval deployment, and maritime law. It had produced a mythology that 3 centuries of novels, films, and general cultural fascination have not yet exhausted. And it had ended, as most things that burn that brightly tend to end, not with a final dramatic gesture, but with the quiet, incremental closing of the conditions that had made it possible. The sea remained, the ships remained. The men who might have sailed them under a black flag found other work, or didn't, and faded into the historical record as the Golden Age settled into legend, which is where it has lived ever since. Scurvy doesn't announce itself dramatically. It creeps. After about 4 to 6 weeks without vitamin C, the timeline varies by individual, things begin going wrong in ways that are both medically fascinating and genuinely terrible to experience. First, a persistent tiredness that sleep doesn't fix. Then the gums. They soften, they swell, they begin to bleed spontaneously when you eat, when you press them, eventually when you do nothing at all. Old wounds that had healed properly begin to reopen, as if the body is revising its earlier decisions. Teeth loosen, joints ache. The skin bruises at the slightest contact. In severe cases, a sailor might die from what was, in hindsight, a dietary problem solvable by eating a lime. The frustrating part, for the sailors and retrospectively for everyone who knows how the story ends, is that the cure was observed repeatedly throughout the 17th and 18th centuries and consistently not acted upon at scale. The observations were there in the historical record, clear enough in retrospect that reading them produces a specific frustration. Richard Hawkins, an English naval commander writing in 1593, noted that sour oranges and lemons were the most effective remedy he had encountered for the disease. A Dutch naval surgeon named Roncius had made similar observations decades earlier. The East India Company had documented the effectiveness of citrus in preventing scurvy among their sailors in the early 1600s. None of this information translated into standard practice. The reasons for this failure are a useful illustration of how knowledge moves, or fails to move, through institutions that are not organized around using it. The diet aboard a pirate ship in the early 1700s contained almost no vitamin C. Salt pork contained none. Hardtack contained none. The rum contained none, though its role in the daily routine suggests that the crew would have appreciated something that both hydrated and prevented scurvy, and that the world owed them at least that much given everything else. Fresh fruit was available in port and consumed eagerly when the ship was near land. At sea, it lasted a week at most before the tropical heat reduced it to something that was more concept than food. Dried fruit and preserved vegetables retained some nutritional value, but not enough, and not reliably. The progression of scurvy in a crew that had been at sea for 2 months without fresh provisions was visible and alarming to anyone who had seen it before. Men who had been healthy at departure became lethargic, then pale, then visibly unwell in ways that the ship's surgeon could identify but not effectively treat with the contents of the medicine chest. The standard response, rest, which was not particularly available, and whatever could be done about the diet, which was not much, addressed the symptoms inadequately. If the ship reached port before the most severe cases progressed past a certain point, recovery was rapid and complete. Fresh food reversed the deficiency within days in a way that contemporary observers found almost miraculous. If the ship did not reach port in time, the severe cases died, and the moderate cases recovered when port was eventually made, and the whole cycle repeated on the next long voyage. You carried the vulnerability with you the entire time, your body slowly spending down a reserve it couldn't replenish, the clock running quietly in the background of every day at sea. The ocean inspires religion. This is not a mystery. Faced with an environment that could kill you without warning in ways you had no power to prevent, the human mind reaches for frameworks that offer some sense of agency over outcome. Pirate ships carried men from every religious tradition that the Atlantic world had assembled, and the result was a culture of layered superstition in which formal religious practice and folk belief coexisted with complete pragmatic comfort. Whistling on deck was thought to invite bad weather. Killing an albatross was catastrophically unlucky, a belief strong enough that Coleridge built an entire narrative poem around it in 1798, suggesting the superstition was widespread and well established. Redheads were considered either very lucky or very unlucky, depending on which crew you asked. Women aboard ship were considered bad luck by the superstitions of the era, a belief that coexisted on Rackham's vessel. With the actual presence of two women who were demonstrably better at their jobs than most of the men around them, a fact that the superstition declined to address. Flat-footed people were unlucky. Priests aboard ship were unlucky. Flowers, which were associated with funerals, were unlucky in ways that were unlikely to cause practical problems on a vessel in the middle of the Atlantic, but were avoided on principle. The number of things considered potentially dangerous by the accumulated superstitions of Atlantic maritime culture was extensive enough that navigating through an ordinary day without inadvertently doing something inauspicious required a certain vigilance. Formal religion persisted alongside the superstitions rather than replacing them. Men who considered themselves Christians, which was most of the crew, in a vague cultural sense that expressed itself in moments of crisis more reliably than in daily practice, offered prayers before battle, during storms, and in the various other circumstances where the gap between what they could control and what might happen was wide enough to require outside assistance. These prayers were genuine. The men offering them were not performing a social ritual. They were doing what frightened people have always done, which is reach towards something larger than themselves and ask for help. Whether the prayers worked is a question the historical record addresses primarily through survivor accounts, which have an obvious selection bias. Bartholomew Roberts, who didn't drink and who kept Sunday as a day of rest for his crew, was by the standards of the era a comparatively religious man. A characterization that required a certain flexibility in defining religious given the broader context of his professional activities. Some pirate captains conducted brief services before battle. Others maintained a kind of operational faith, a private relationship with Providence that expressed itself in the article's provision for the injured, in the equitable distribution of shares, in the maintenance of a code that was, within its own terms, consistently applied. There is something in the Golden Age pirates' combination of formal rule-making and genuine faith in their own system that reads, across 3 centuries, as a kind of secular religion, a belief that the articles, if observed, would produce a fair outcome, and that fairness, even in this context, was worth maintaining. It didn't always work, but they kept observing the articles anyway, which is perhaps what faith looks like in practice. If you were caught, you were going to trial, and the trial was not going to take long. Admiralty courts had jurisdiction over piracy, which meant that cases were heard by naval judges rather than civilian juries, with rules of evidence that leaned heavily toward conviction. The standard sentence was death by hanging. The location was often a place called Execution Dock in Wapping, London, a site on the Thames where condemned pirates were hanged at the low water mark and left until 3 tides had washed over them, a symbolic final statement about the jurisdiction of the sea. After the hanging, the body of a particularly notable pirate might be tarred, coated in preservative tar, and displayed in a metal cage called a gibbet at a prominent location along a shipping channel, sometimes for years, as a visible warning to passing sailors. The trial process was efficient in ways that the accused generally found unsatisfying. Evidence was presented, witnesses were called, and the accused was given an opportunity to speak in their defense, an opportunity that was formally observed and practically limited by the fact that the court had usually already determined the outcome before the proceedings began. Confessions obtained under duress were admissible. Testimony from co-defendants who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences was standard practice. The distinction between a genuine pirate and a sailor who had been pressed into a pirate crew against his will was theoretically important and practically difficult to establish in a court that was primarily interested in demonstrating consequences rather than achieving fine-grained accuracy. Some trials produced acquittals, which were genuinely surprising to everyone involved and which the Crown accepted with visible reluctance. Colonial juries, where they had jurisdiction, were occasionally sympathetic to defendants whose piracy had been directed at shipping that the local population didn't much like, Spanish, Portuguese, or merchant companies whose commercial practices were not universally admired. These acquittals were among the reasons the Crown moved piracy cases into admiralty jurisdiction, where juries of local citizens with local sympathies were replaced by naval judges with clearer institutional priorities. The gibbet was the final act of a process designed to communicate through the body. A hanged body in a metal cage, suspended at the entrance to a harbour, visible to every ship entering and leaving, said something specific and durable about consequences. It said it in a language that required no literacy, no translation, and no explanation. Every sailor who passed it understood it. Some of the men who passed it had sailed with the man inside it, or had considered the life he had led and decided, for one reason or another, that they would not. The gibbet hung at the intersection of biography and warning. It was, in the most literal possible sense, a dead end, and it swung in the harbour wind for years after the man inside it had stopped being able to care, delivering its message to ships that had never heard his name and would never need to. 300 years after the Golden Age ended, pirates remain one of the most reliably popular subjects in fiction, film, games, and general cultural fascination, and it's worth asking why. The answer has something to do with the specific fantasy that piracy represents. Freedom from institutional authority, a life organized around personal loyalty rather than official hierarchy, the possibility of genuine adventure and dramatic consequence in a world where most lives involve neither. The reality, as you have spent considerable time learning tonight, was rather different. But reality has never been particularly competitive with a good story, and the pirate story is a genuinely excellent one, a brief, vivid, violent moment when a collection of desperate, creative, and sometimes genuinely idealistic people built an alternative society in the cracks of the official world and made it work for a little while before the Navy arrived. The mythology took shape almost immediately. By the 1720s, while the Golden Age was still technically ongoing, popular accounts of pirate lives were being published in London for an audience that consumed them with an enthusiasm that suggests the appeal was already well established. A general history of the pirates, published in 1724 under the name Captain Charles Johnson, almost certainly a pseudonym, possibly for Daniel Defoe, provided detailed, vivid, and not entirely reliable accounts of the major Golden Age captains that shaped public perception of piracy for the next 3 centuries. It gave Blackbeard his smoke-wreathed legend. It gave Anne Bonny and Mary Read their starring roles. It gave the Golden Age its narrative shape, heroes, villains, codes, and consequences, and almost everything that followed owes it an acknowledged or unacknowledged debt. Treasure Island, published in 1883, added the buried treasure and Long John Silver, and cemented the visual and narrative vocabulary that most people carry when they think of pirates. The parrot on the shoulder, which appears in Treasure Island, became standard iconography despite having essentially no basis in historical practice. Pirates did occasionally keep animals aboard because animals were entertainment on long voyages, but a parrot perched on a shoulder during a boarding action was an accessory that would have struck working pirates as both impractical and slightly unserious. The peg leg, similarly, Long John Silver's most recognizable feature, was a literary device that extrapolated from the real phenomenon of pirate injury and amputation into something more symbolic than literal. What persists beneath the mythology is something genuine. The articles were real. The democracy was real, imperfect and violent as it was. The men who signed those articles were real, displaced, exploited, and willing to stake their lives on an alternative arrangement. The Golden Age produced people who built something outside the official world, who governed themselves by rules they had written together, who divided their gains by a formula everyone had agreed to in advance. That this enterprise was criminal, that it caused real harm to real people, that it ended badly for most of the people involved, all of this is also real. The romance and the reality coexist, and the coexistence is what makes the story last. We love pirates because they represent the possibility of opting out, and we love the fact that it didn't quite work because it confirms what we already suspected, that opting out is harder than it looks, and the ocean is less forgiving than the fantasy. You've made it this far. The bad food, the worse water, the hammock, the weather, the politics, the scurvy. You've learned the articles, met the crew, survived the storm. And now, on what will turn out to be your last day aboard, things are about to go sideways in a way that is both entirely preventable and, in retrospect, absolutely inevitable. Maybe it's a naval frigate that appeared on the horizon at dawn. Maybe it's a target that turned out to be better armed than advertised. Maybe the crew voted, at the worst possible moment, to do something that a reasonable person would describe as extremely inadvisable. This is the thing about a life organized around risk. The risk eventually wins. Not for everyone, and not every time, but often enough that the golden age of piracy lasted approximately 2 decades before the world collectively decided it had had enough and sent the Navy. The morning starts badly. The lookout reports a sail on the horizon, and the captain, your captain, the man the crew elected and could unelect and has been arguing about for 3 weeks, makes a decision. Maybe he decides to chase it. Maybe the decision is made by vote, which is how major tactical choices are supposed to go, but which, in the urgency of a morning chase, tends to mean that whoever speaks first and loudest carries the room. The crew moves to their stations with the practiced efficiency of men who have done this many times, and the ship comes around onto the new heading, and for a while everything looks like it might go well, because it usually looks like it might go well right up until the moment it doesn't. The target is faster than it looked, or it's not running at all. The sail on the horizon resolves into something with gun ports and a flag that creates an immediate reassessment of the situation. The captain gives an order. Someone questions it. The argument that has been building for 3 weeks about the captain's judgment surfaces at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible forum, shouted on a deck where everyone is armed, and the outcome of the argument will determine whether the ship turns and runs or stands and fights. This is how Golden Age piracy actually ended, on individual ships, on individual mornings, not with a dramatic final stand, but with a decision made under pressure by tired men operating at the limit of their luck. If you're captured rather than killed in the engagement, the subsequent process is efficient and unwelcoming. You are taken aboard the naval vessel. You are searched. You are put in irons if the ship has them and confined if it doesn't. You will be taken to the nearest colonial port with an admiralty court, and the trial will be brief, and the outcome will be what the outcome almost always is. You will think, in the time available to you for thinking, about the articles you signed and the shares you received, and the mornings at sea that were genuinely, unexpectedly beautiful in ways that you hadn't anticipated when you first came aboard. You will think about the men you sailed with, the ones who are dead now, the ones who are in irons beside you, the ones who somehow got away. You had a life out here that was unlike any other life available to you, and it was terrible in specific ways, and occasionally extraordinary in others, and it is over. The gibbet at the harbour entrance will swing in the wind for a few years afterward, and the ships passing beneath it will not know your name, which is exactly how it was always going to end. Somewhere between your 3rd week at sea and your 4th, you will notice that you have started talking differently. Not dramatically, not in the theatrical way of someone who has decided to perform being a sailor, but in the practical, incremental way that happens when you spend enough time inside a specific culture that its vocabulary starts replacing your own. The language of Golden Age pirates was not the R-laden dialect of popular imagination, which was largely invented by a single West Country actor named Robert Newton in a 1950 film, and has since become so thoroughly embedded in the cultural shorthand for piracy that it has displaced whatever the actual speech patterns were. What the actual speech patterns were is a more interesting question, and the answer involves a creole of maritime terminology, criminal slang, Atlantic port vernacular, and the various languages of the men who made up the crew. Maritime vocabulary was its own language within a language, and you learned it fast because not knowing it had immediate practical consequences. The front of the ship was the bow, the back was the stern. The right side, when facing forward, was starboard, from the Old Norse word for the steering side, because early boats were steered with an oar on the right. The left side was port, or larboard in older usage, a word that survived into the 19th century before being replaced because it sounded too much like starboard when shouted over the noise of a storm. Lines were ropes with specific functions and specific names, and calling a line a rope in front of an experienced sailor was the maritime equivalent of using a fork for your soup. You learned the names, or you spent your first months being corrected with the particular weary contempt that experts reserve for beginners who haven't yet understood how much they don't know. Criminal slang from the London underworld had travelled to sea in the mouths of the men recruited from English ports and prisons. Cant, the specialised vocabulary of thieves and vagabonds documented by various writers from the 16th century onward, appears in pirate trial transcripts and contemporary accounts often enough to suggest it was in active use. Coin was referred to by terms that shifted regularly, partly because criminal slang evolves to stay ahead of the authorities who are trying to understand it, and partly because the men using it took a certain pleasure in the linguistic creativity. A man who didn't know the current term for something identified himself as an outsider, which on a pirate ship was a designation with practical consequences. The Atlantic ports where pirates reprovisioned were themselves linguistic mixing bowls. Nassau, Tortuga, and the various other waypoints of the Golden Age brought together English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, and the various Caribbean creoles that had developed in the previous century, as enslaved people from different African language groups found ways to communicate with each other and with their captors. A pirate crew moving through these ports absorbed vocabulary the way a ship's hull absorbed barnacles, steadily, invisibly, and in ways that changed the character of the thing without dramatically altering its shape. Words for food, for weather, for the various activities of port life arrived in the crew's speech and stayed there. What emerged was not a single pirate language, but a range of individual voices shaped by common experience. The man who had been a naval sailor from Bristol spoke differently from the man who had been a merchant seaman from Barbados, and both spoke differently from the man who had been an escaped indentured servant from Virginia. What they shared was the maritime vocabulary, the cant of their trade, and the specific idioms that developed aboard ships, where the same situations recurred often enough to develop their own shorthand. You couldn't exactly call it beautiful, but it was precise, it was alive, and after a few months inside it, you would find that it had become, without your noticing, your first language. Nobody puts boredom in the pirate legend. The legend has storms, battles, treasure, and dramatic moral crises conducted on moving ships in tropical weather. What it does not have, because it is not cinematic and does not compress well into a 2-hour film, is the weeks. The long, flat, featureless weeks of open ocean sailing, in which nothing happened, nothing was sighted, nothing changed except the slow rotation of the watch schedule and the gradual deterioration of the provisions. These weeks were, by sheer volume, the majority of the pirate experience, and they were, in their quiet, grinding way, as dangerous as the storms and the naval pursuits, because boredom on a ship full of armed, Frustrated men with nothing to do had consequences that were both predictable and difficult to prevent. The watch schedule divided the day into 4-hour rotations, which meant that at any given time, roughly half the crew was officially off duty. Off duty did not mean comfortable. It meant not currently required to be somewhere specific, which on a ship the size of most pirate vessels meant that your off-duty options were roughly the hammock, the deck, or some intermediate position between the two. You slept when you could. You ate at the prescribed times. You talked to the men around you, which became progressively more difficult as the weeks accumulated and the available conversational material was exhausted and re-exhausted, until you were having discussions you had already had 3 times, with men whose opinions on every subject you already knew, in a space you could cross in 30 seconds. Gambling, officially banned by most articles, happened anyway in the quiet corners of the ship where the quartermaster wasn't looking. Cards, dice and games involving small wagers that were technically within the rules and technically not within the rules occupied hours that would otherwise have been occupied by escalating irritability. Music helped. The ship's fiddler or piper was earning their share during the long flat passages in ways that no amount of combat duty could fully compensate for, because they were the difference between a crew that had something to listen to and a crew that had only its own thoughts. Stories were told and retold. Older sailors described voyages and harbours that the younger men had not seen. Bragging, embellishment, and outright invention filled the gap between what had actually happened and what made for an interesting evening. The boredom had physical effects that the historical record captures obliquely. Men who had been at sea for 3 weeks without encountering a prize became restless in ways that expressed themselves in minor conflicts, in short tempers over trivial provocations, in the kind of low-level social friction that the articles had tried to anticipate and manage, but couldn't fully prevent, because it was less about rule violations than about human beings running out of resources for tolerating each other. Captains who understood this managed it through activity, invented tasks, maintenance work, drills, because a crew that was doing something was a crew that was not doing the other things that boredom produced. Captains who didn't understand it, or who didn't care, found that the weeks of nothing had a way of producing, suddenly and with poor timing, a great deal of something. The sea doesn't care that you're bored. It continues being enormous and indifferent regardless of how you feel about it. You stared at the horizon for days, and the horizon stared back and offered nothing. And then one morning, the lookout called out, and everyone moved at once, and for the next few hours the boredom was gone completely, replaced by something that was either much better or much worse depending on what the sail on the horizon turned out to be. But then that was over, and the sea was enormous again, and you were back in the weeks and there was nothing to do but wait. So here you are. You've made it through the whole day, or rather you've made it through the whole life. You woke up on a ship that smelled like something had died in the hull, signed a contract written by criminals, ate a biscuit with things living in it, drank water that was trying to kill you, slept in a hammock 18 inches from a man whose name you still weren't entirely sure about, survived a storm that had no interest in your survival, and spent 3 weeks staring at a horizon that never changed. You watched the food get worse. You watched the water get greener. You watched the men around you get tireder and shorter-tempered and more creative about their grievances. You learned the language. You learned the rules. You learned which end of the ship was which, and which ropes had names, and which superstitions were observed, and which ones were observed only by the newer crew members who hadn't yet developed the confidence to ignore them. And somewhere in all of that, in the flat weeks and the sudden violence and the democratic arguments about which direction to sail and the grog at sundown and the music in the evenings when the fiddler was in a decent mood, there was a life. Not a comfortable one, not a long one in most cases, not one that ended well or in retirement or in a quiet house somewhere with money in a chest and grandchildren asking questions, but a life that was, for the people living it, genuinely their own, in a way that very few lives in the early 18th century managed to be. These were men, and occasionally women, who had been failed by every institution their world had to offer, and who had sat down together and written their own rules and elected their own leaders and divided their own spoils and sailed their own course. They were violent and desperate and frequently terrible to the people they encountered at sea. They were also, in their way, building something small and flawed and perpetually on the edge of dissolution, but something that was theirs. And that, more than the treasure, which mostly didn't exist, and more than the flags, which were mostly theatre, and more than the battles, which were mostly over in minutes, is what the golden age of piracy actually was. A brief, improbable experiment in self-governance conducted on wooden ships in the middle of the Atlantic by people the world had thrown away. They didn't last. They were never going to last. The Navy was always going to come. The safe harbours were always going to close. The pardon was always going to split the crews, and the world was always going to reassert itself, as worlds do, over the small rebellions people attempt against it. The Golden Age ended not with a dramatic final battle, but with the quiet accumulation of consequences, trials and gibbets and pardons, and the gradual disappearance of the conditions that had made it possible. And the sea went on without them, enormous and indifferent, as it had always been. So tonight, as you lie in your bed, your clean, still, non-leaking bed, with its pillow and its sheets and its complete absence of weevils, maybe spare a quiet thought for the men who slept in hammocks over black water, who ate the hardtack and drank the grog and signed the articles and sailed out into the Atlantic, not knowing if they were sailing toward a prize or a naval frigate or a storm that would end everything. They were not heroes, exactly. They were not villains, exactly. They were people, making the best available decisions in the worst available circumstances on ships that creaked and leaked and smelled terrible, under skies that were sometimes magnificent and sometimes trying to kill them. They were afraid, most of the time, in the quiet way that people are afraid when they have accepted danger as the condition of their lives and learned to keep moving anyway. They were funny and petty and brave in specific moments and cowardly in others, and they argued about the articles and the food and the captain's last decision, and they sang in the evenings when the fiddler played, and they watched the horizon for something that might change their luck. They were human, which is to say they were complicated, and the ocean didn't care, and they sailed on anyway. Sleep well. You've earned it more than you know, and be grateful, genuinely, quietly grateful, that the biggest thing you have to navigate tonight is the distance between where you are and where you're going, which is approximately 12 inches, and ends in a pillow.